A couple hiked into Cold Spring Canyon for a casual day trip and simply ceased to exist. Michael Carver and Elena Ruiz parked their car at the trailhead just after sunrise, laced their boots with the casual certainty of people who had done this many times before, and stepped into a world that would not give them back. The last trace of them was a pair of footprints pressed into dust and a receipt crumpled in a pocket from a roadside stand miles away from the canyon. The sun was merciless, the canyon walls holding heat like a kiln, and by late afternoon the wind scraped grit across the parking lot as rangers swung their flashlights through the brush and told themselves there would be a simple explanation by morning. There never was. At home, a porch light burned through the night for people who did not return, and a phone clattered to voicemail, and a neighbor's dog barked at the empty street as if sound could summon what had gone missing. Days bled into weeks, and then into a calendar's slow march of anniversaries that no one wanted to mark. Birthdays and holidays where the empty chairs were a contour of absence more vivid than any presence. The canyon carried off voices. The canyon made its own rules. Search teams converged with maps and radios, and that brittle optimism that lives between sunrise and noon. They swept arroyos, probed thickets, startled lizards and owls, and called names into stone that threw the names back at them empty. The car was found right where it should have been, a neat square in the gravel, a sun-faded dash, and water bottles in cup holders sweating themselves dry. Inside the glove box, a trail brochure unfolded like an instruction sheet for how not to die. But paper cannot climb out of a ravine. Paper cannot stand in for a heartbeat. The first week was a choreography of hope. Grids flagged in fluorescent tape, the hiss of radios in the heat, and the helicopter's rotor wash flattening grass as cameras searched for color against colorless rock. The canyon offered nothing. It swallowed footprints with a gust, drank scents with noon heat, and turned the wide world into a slender corridor bounded by stone. When the volunteers went home, the canyon stayed. The missing became a lesson in time, how it stretches, how it thins, how it frays. The people closest to Michael and Elena became archivists of small things. A coffee mug sat unwashed because the imprint of a lip was more sacred than any shrine. A sweater stayed draped over a chair. A spare key stayed under a flat rock, as if habit could lure luck. Every time the phone rang, it was the same. A new voice at the other end. Earnest, certain. A driver who thought he had seen them. A hiker who remembered a bright jacket. A camper who heard a cry that might have been human. False leads were a kind of mercy, because they were at least something to chase. A farmer miles away found a bandana and swore it was theirs. It wasn't. A fisherman claimed a backpack in a culvert had initials scratched into plastic. It didn't. Rumors became their own cartography. A cabin deep in the hills where strangers were taken. A tunnel blasted in the 30s that connected two canyons. And a well, the old-timers said, had no bottom. People called late at night, with sightings that felt like confessions. The investigation hardened into a ritual of patience. Files thickened with interviews. A whiteboard gathers dates like weather collects dust. There were maps layered upon maps, arrows in grease pencil, pointing to places that would be hiked again when the season broke, when the river fell, when snow defined edges and made what was hidden stand in relief. The canyon on a winter dawn is a cathedral cleared of its choir. You hear the bones of the place. You see where water once was, and where it will be again. The searchers walked then too, breath strung in front of them, boots squeaking in crusted frost. They followed the logic of flow lines, where a body would tumble, where fabric would snag, and where a metal clip would catch light. Each theory survived exactly as long as the next silence. There were people who loved Michael and Elena who did not go into the canyon. They had different work. They learned the language of forms and the taste of waiting rooms and the ritual of signing documents that made no sense. They sat with detectives at kitchen tables while coffee went cold. They told stories that tried to capture a person entirely. This is how laughter sounded. This is how stubbornness looked. And this is the bend of a wrist when the radio dial is changed. They remembered the small arguments that feel monstrous in hindsight, and the last text that was a grocery list, punctuated with an unassuming heart. They kept the mailbox clear, refused to forward the address, and refused to let time forward anything. The canyon stood in for 100 possibilities, each door opening onto a different room where cause and chance pretended to be the same thing. The first year passes, and by then the case is both new and old, both urgent and archived. A new ranger walks the perimeter and memorizes the names. The old one keeps a notebook of slopes and chutes, a quiet index of where stubbornness might be useful, and where humility should take over. The logbooks at the trailhead accumulate the ghosts of strangers, cheerful handwriting, strangers who finished the loop, strangers who turned back at the switchback because the heat pressed their hearts into their throats. There's a line in every logbook that is an unintentional epitaph. Great views today, watch your step. Time made other shapes. Relationships frayed, then strengthened, then frayed again. Someone tried moving to a new city, lasted 6 months, and came back because the streetlights were wrong. Someone else took up running before dawn and wore out 3 pairs of shoes, learning the exact distance between exhaustion and relief. A private investigator added a layer of grit to the procedure, knocked on the doors the official search had cataloged but didn't favor, and asked questions in a bar that never made it into any report. He developed a theory about a hidden trail across the eastern face and found a man who swore he had once taken it, who pointed with a beer bottle at a notch in a ridge and said, "There, that's where you decide what you are made of." A storm came through the next spring and rearranged the canyon's grammar. Trees fell where trees had stood for decades, and a long wall of hardened mud let go all at once and carried saplings and stones in a slide that ended in a fan that looked from the air like a pale hand spread on the earth. Another search was mounted. Another dog wore itself out, sorting old scent from new. The helicopter pointed and circled, and again the canyon did what it always does. It absorbed attention and returned silence. In the second year, a new theory took hold that felt less like a story and more like a ritual of acceptance, that a misstep had fed the canyon its due, that both had fallen into a seam too narrow for a human body to maneuver, and that water and time had made gentler what had been sharp. People said it gently, like a prayer. At least they went together. Year 3 became the year of theories. The maps on the living room floor were replaced by digital layers on a laptop screen that never slept. Satellite imagery filtered through seasons, scar lines like fingernails across slopes, and shade migrating with the calendar. People told stories that calcified into fact, because repetition can turn suggestions into stone. One story said they had accepted a ride from a stranger at the highway bend because the heat was unbearable and water ran out, and pride bends when thirst doesn't. Another story said they had stepped off the main path at a narrow junction that isn't a junction at all, but the echo of a deer trail that vanishes 30 yards later into brittle scrub. You can see it clearly from one angle and not at all from another, like regret. An old man who camped in a ravine every spring for quail swore he'd heard a whistle that wasn't a bird, a high, thin human note riding the wind. He stood with a ranger and pointed into a fold of land and said, "There, right there, is the place that sound belongs to." But when boots went there, the earth offered only the complicated handwriting of animals. Their car, meanwhile, endured the seasons as a witness who could not testify. Dust wrote its name across glass. Pine needles gathered in a cowl like a shawl. The registration renewed itself automatically on a bank draft until someone noticed and canceled it with the mild ceremony of signing a form titled revocation. Inside, a guidebook curled at the edges, and a pen rolled with the slope each time wind nudged a tire. A spare key wrapped in blue tape lived in a magnetic box under the bumper, like a promise no one kept. There was a detective who did not let it go. She was not assigned to the case anymore, but these things are personal in ways policy can't quantify. She kept the file near the front of her cabinet, where it would catch her eye when she reached for something else. She made a habit of driving the highway once each month on her own time, pulling off at the mile marker with the bent post and walking the first half-mile in whatever weather the canyon offered. She cataloged changes: a cairn knocked down, a new scratch from rockfall on a boulder shaped like a sleeping dog, and the way water carved a deeper lip in a small, natural bowl that collects rain and evaporates to leave a ring of salt. She thought about how Michael and Elena moved through this same corridor and where fear might have arrived, if it ever arrived. She didn't believe in clear-cut villains for every missing pair. Sometimes the place is the antagonist, sometimes time. Once she got a call from a man in a motel 3 towns away who whispered like he was in a church and swore the couple was living under new names 2 states over, and he had proof because he'd seen a scar in the exact shape of a comma on the woman's wrist. She thanked him, filed it, and drove out anyway, because sometimes what you know and what you owe are at odds. It wasn't them. It was never them. In the 4th year, a wildfire came like a long exhale of a dragon, leaping ridges in gusts and erasing landmarks that had anchored searchers' mental maps. Ash rewrote the canyon. When the crews were done and the smoke thinned to a faint smear, the place looked new and terribly old at once. Char made a contrast. The detective went back with a forestry crew and a smaller search team, because fire reveals and fire hides, and you don't know which until you walk it. They found bones, but they were deer and coyote, sorted by an expert whose hands knew the vocabulary of joints. They found a melted beer bottle that had been hiding for decades and now glinted like a dropped emerald on black soil. They found a rusted belt buckle and a scorched glove and a pair of sunglasses half sunk in ash that had seen a different summer. The canyon offered up its small dead and kept its secrets. In the 5th year, the missing became a case study at a regional conference in a fluorescent-lit hotel ballroom where coffee was always tepid and optimism was served in 1-hour increments. PowerPoints clicked. Phrases like probability radius and terrain difficulty indexes were arranged into neat visual hierarchies that made chaos look negotiable. But in the hall after the session, an old tracker with a white braid and a faded ball cap said the thing everyone knew and seldom put on slides: sometimes you walk past them. In the 6th year, a new ranger with a graduate degree in hydrology suggested mapping the canyon's seasonal seeps to those places where water expresses itself briefly and then recedes because anything that moves will, at some point, pass that way. The team marked those places with GPS and returned when the ground was dry to sieve pebbles and fine material, looking for the stubborn truth metals tell: a zipper tooth, a key ring, a button whose edges looked like a tiny crescent moon. They found nothing. Silence built a cathedral around the case. That silence had rooms. In one of them sat a friend who had never forgiven herself for not insisting on going that day because she had a bad feeling, a phrase that means nothing and everything depending on which door opens after. She wore her guilt like a necklace she would not take off, worrying it with her fingers whenever the conversation wandered near the canyon's gravity. In another room sat Michael's father with a deck of cards and a cribbage board, and the insistence on keeping score, as if order could be coaxed from randomness. Tally marks accumulate, even when lives do not. In another room sat Elena's sister, who placed fresh flowers on a windowsill every Sunday and then threw them out on Thursday because she refused to let anything wilt in front of her again. Year 7 brought a small noise. A climber new to the region posted a photo online of a shaded chimney in a wall not far from the main trail, an angle that hadn't made it into most amateur archives, and in the corner of one frame, a blur looked like fabric. The detective saw it at midnight when she couldn't sleep and messaged him. They met at sunrise. He showed her the wall and the angle and the photo, without compression artifacts, and the blur looked less like fabric and more like lichen. But rocks keep their masks well. She logged it, climbed it with him, scraped her knuckles, and felt the cool throat of the stone like a breath. The place said nothing. In the 8th year, a letter arrived, without a return address, handwritten in a tidy block script. It said, "You'll find them where water hides, boxed by hands that stack," and there was a sketch of a rectangle under 2 parallel lines. And then the letter ended with the sentence, "I was there. I was scared. I ran." It looked like a prank, the kind of cruelty that attaches itself to grief because some people need to touch a bruise. But the detective took it seriously, because her inventory of reasons to ignore things had long since run out. She showed it to 2 different linguists who said different meaningful-sounding things and canceled each other out. She showed it to a mason who said it looked like a culvert. She showed it to an old rancher who had grazed stock near the canyon decades ago. He said it looked like nothing at all. False leads are also a way of continuing to look without admitting it's for you as much as for them. The 10th year grew quiet. One of the searchers moved away. A volunteer who had shown up every weekend set down his pack and learned how to be still, because the body cannot live on adrenaline forever. The detective made a promise to herself to let the canyon sleep unless it woke her, and that promise bent but did not break. She took another case that ended and reminded her that some stories do. The winter of the 11th year announced itself not with snow, but with a freeze that split rocks with tiny gunshot cracks and lifted whole plates of soil like thumbnail parings. In the spring, 2 boys who liked to explore places the maps don't name found a small opening in a boulder jumble they'd never noticed and crawled in until the air turned cold and the light behind them felt too far away. They scrambled out laughing for the thrill of being afraid and never told anyone, because the joy was in the secret. A woman in a nearby town dreamt she was handed a small stone with an initial scratched into it and woke crying. But when she went to the box where she kept the stone from the first hike they all took together, there was no initial, only time's polish. The 12th year brought a drought that made the canyon seams gape and its grass go the color of old paper. That summer, a kid with a metal detector no one knew he owned because he loved the idea of treasure more than treasure's display, wandered near the trailhead's edge and listened to the conversation of beeps that meant bottle caps and pull tabs, and one lead slug from a bullet. He took them home like trophies of sound. He was 10 and infinite. The 13th year, a couple posed for a photo at the overlook, framed by the canyon's indifferent beauty, and when they looked at the image later, a pale smear on the rock behind them was just sunlight or dust or memory doing its parlor trick. The 14th year, a ranger who had been new then was going gray now, and still paused at the exact place the trail narrows, by a leaning juniper, and lets you see how small you are. He touched its bark and told it, as he always did, to keep standing. The 15th year, the detective retired, officially and unofficially, kept keys to the small room where evidence lives. She would sometimes open the cabinet and stand very still, the way you do in a museum when you realize you are looking at an original and not a print. She believed, without proof, that the canyon had not lied to her. It had only withheld. The 16th year, a late spring storm flung rain against rock, with a fury that sounded like applause and pried out things wedged where eyes rarely go. A small wash carved itself 2 feet deeper and revealed the rib of a fence post. Embedded so long ago, the wood had turned to something like stone. A boy found an arrowhead after the storm and felt like a king. And then, year 17, arrived without ceremony, just a light that belonged to late afternoon, bending gold around edges, and a wind that came up from the west in a mood to move small things. A pair of graduate students in a program no one could explain, at family dinners, hiked the canyon to measure microclimates for a study that would matter to a handful of people and perhaps to something larger no one could see yet. They carried instruments and notebooks and the kind of stubborn curiosity that makes people annoyingly good at what they do. They were not looking for anyone. They were looking for numbers. At the far shoulder of a switchback where the wall throws shade like a bruise, one of them stepped off trail to mark a cooler pocket and noticed a vertical seam in a talus face that seemed too clean. Talus is a mess by definition. Clean lines are suspect. He kneeled. The edge of the seam was mortared with dust and time, but a pebble displaced by his boot rolled in and did not hit bottom the way a pebble should. He said, "Listen." The other one crouched, listened, and nodded, and they both felt that electric hum that runs along the spine when a pattern shifts and a new picture waits to be seen. They pried gently with fingers, and then with the aluminum handle of a thermometer, and then with a flat rock, and the seam widened on a sigh. Cold air was breathed out. The smell was mineral, old, and faintly organic in the way that a cellar remembers everything stored there, and it carried a whisper of something else the students could not name, but would remember later as the moment the canyon decided to speak. The air that sighed from the seam in the rock was not the kind that belongs to surface places. It was older, colder, and touched with minerals that had seeped through for centuries, and both students felt an instinctive hush fall over them, as if the canyon itself had asked for silence. They widened the seam carefully until a narrow crevice was revealed, just large enough for one body to squeeze through. One of them fetched a headlamp, the other steadied his hand against stone, and together they pressed into the throat of the canyon's secret. Inside, the light fell on walls streaked with calcite, and shadows that refused to move. Dust and pebbles shifted under their boots, and the air grew tighter, the smell of damp stone clinging to their skin. Then, a glint, not bright, not new, but metallic something wedged in rubble. The student crouched, brushed carefully, and his hand froze. A fragment of fabric, sunless and gray, revealed itself from beneath a thin drift of sediment. Another sweep of his hand uncovered a strap, leather, decayed, its buckle eaten but still recognizable as the remnant of a backpack harness. He drew back, his throat dry, and whispered to the other, "There's something here." Their voices sounded wrong in the chamber, too sharp, too alive against walls that had held their silence for nearly 2 decades. They pulled out their phones, took hurried photos, then stumbled back into daylight, their nerves jangling. One of them dialed 911 with shaking fingers. The dispatcher's tone was practiced calm, but the weight of 17 years pressed down the line as coordinates were given and repeated, and promises of response echoed through static. The canyon does not rush, but men do. Within hours, the site was marked by bright tape and the slow rhythm of boots trained to preserve what curiosity had uncovered. Rangers stood guard, their faces taut with the gravity of the moment as a forensics team threaded carefully into the crevice with halogen lamps and evidence kits. Dust rose, caught in light beams like 1,000 tiny ghosts. The first object bagged was the backpack, or what remained of it. It seems brittle, its contents fused together by time and pressure. A pen, its plastic warped. A notebook, illegible, paper welded into a single pulp. A watch that had stopped not from the battery, but from the crush of stone. Then, the discovery that hardened every face into silence. Human bones pressed into the contours of the crevice, as though the rock had folded around them. They were arranged not by choice but by collapse. Long shapes tangled, a skull resting in the shallow cradle of fractured limestone. Beside it, another. 2 sets, close together, their presence undeniable even before measurements confirmed what the canyon had held back. 17 years of waiting, answered in one instant. Michael Carver and Elena Ruiz had not walked out. They had been here all along, sealed in by the canyon's shifting face. Forensics worked with reverence. Each fragment was logged, photographed, and lifted with brushes and gloved hands. Personal effects were gathered. A pair of boots, soles intact but leather as stiff as bark. A thin chain with a pendant dull from stone dust, and a ring whose engraving had blurred but still whispered of a vow once made. A map folded into quarters, its edges nibbled by time but legible enough to see the red pen marking a trail they had meant to take. A camera, shattered, but its memory card intact, slipped quickly into an evidence bag, as if guarding the last vision of the lost. Outside the crevice, the detective who had carried their names for years stood still, hands at her sides, eyes fixed not on the present but on the long shadow of the past. She had walked these walls too many times, doubted herself too many nights, and told families words that never satisfied. Now she listened as the canyon gave her its confession. News traveled fast. Families were called with voices, careful and steady, but nothing can soften the landing of 17 years of absence, resolving into a single word: found. Grief reopened like an old wound torn fresh. Because closure does not close it, only rearranges the ache. Some wept. Some sat in silence, staring at walls as if waiting for voices to seep through. A mother lit a candle and whispered her daughter's name again and again, as if to remind the world that she had been real, that she was still real. The site remained cordoned, but rumors spread like wildfire. Locals whispered in cafes and at gas stations. How could they have been so close all along? How many times had searchers walked within yards of them, blind to the seam that had hidden everything? Theories multiplied. A misstep? A sudden rockfall? Had they sought shelter and been trapped when the canyon shifted? Or had something darker led them here? Something with human intent? The detective studied the bones, the placement of gear, and the fractured walls, and felt that familiar stir of doubt. Nature is cruel, yes, but it is also precise. And this story was not yet precise enough. Evidence would tell. Forensics would speak. But that would take time, and time had already drawn its long knife across this story. As evening fell on the canyon, lights glowed within the seam, investigators still working, still peeling back silence. Outside, the sky deepened into indigo. The wind carried the smell of dust and pine, and the canyon seemed to breathe slower, as though relieved of a burden it had held too long. The detective turned away only once the bones were lifted, once the crevice was marked for further study. She knew this was not an ending, but a beginning, disguised as one. Because bones answer one question but raise 100 more, and the canyon had not yet told all it knew. The canyon had given up its dead, but the investigation had only begun. Bones alone tell little until science draws its circles around them. The remains of Michael Carver and Elena Ruiz were carried from the rock crevice in a quiet procession, each bag sealed, each step careful on the jagged ground. The silence among the team was heavy, as if conversation might shatter the fragile line between discovery and desecration. At the field station, the work unfolded with ritual. Forensic anthropologists catalogued each bone with gloved hands, aligning fragments on white tables beneath sterile light. Measurements were taken, fractures studied, and soil samples compared to surrounding strata. Cause of death, the elusive phrase, became the question that hovered above every motion. Rockfall was the simplest explanation. The fractures in the long bones and the collapse pattern all suggested a sudden crush, a weight descending in an instant. But there were inconsistencies. Some fractures showed sharp edges, recent at the time of death, but others bore signs of trauma less easily blamed on falling stone. A femur splintered in a way more consistent with blunt force than with the slow grinding press of rock. A skull with a fissure line, not aligned with surrounding debris. The forensic team debated quietly, their voices flat and technical, while the detective listened and noted. She had heard such debates before, and she knew that science often hesitates before certainty. But her instincts, those unprovable currents that carried her through years of unanswered cases, whispered that this was not an accident sealed in stone. Personal belongings deepened the mystery. The pendant found with Elena's remains bore no scratches, as though shielded from the collapse. The ring on Michael's hand showed no crushing distortion, though the bones beneath it had been shattered. The map, strangely intact, had been folded with care, as if returned to a pocket in a moment of pause rather than left open in use. Most unsettling was the camera. When its memory card was carefully dried and coaxed to life by digital technicians, it revealed images grainy, muted by time, but legible enough to pull the past into the present. A sequence of photographs: the trailhead under a noon sun, Michael grinning with a hand raised in mock salute, Elena laughing, hair caught by the wind. Further along the canyon, the walls narrow, shadows lengthen. Then a shot of a storm cloud shouldering over the ridgeline, the light already dimming. The last photograph was blurred, taken in haste. A smear of rock, a slant of shadow, and what looked like a hand lifted not in greeting but in warning. The image was cropped too tight, the focus too soft, but the tension in it was unmistakable. Investigators argued over interpretation. A stumble while photographing? A lens fault? Or a record of the final moment before everything went wrong? Families gathered in sterile rooms to be told what had been found. The detective stood at the front, her voice steady but not impersonal, recounting each item, each fragment, each piece of evidence. Mothers pressed tissues to their faces. A brother stared at the table, unmoving, his jaw clamped as if to hold back an ocean. A father whispered, 17 years, and this is what we have, as if the bones were an insult rather than an answer. Grief is not satisfied by evidence. Grief wants miracles, or failing that, villains to blame. That night the story broke in the press. Headlines spoke of remains found, closure after years, and the canyon yielding its secret. But in the shadows of comments and late-night talk, questions multiplied. Why were they hidden so deep in a crevice rarely touched by climbers? Why had searches failed to find them when the canyon had been scoured? Why did the fractures not align cleanly with rockfall alone? Theories rose again, newly fed. Some insisted foul play had threaded itself into the canyon's silence, that someone had led Michael and Elena off the main trail. Others clung to the comfort of accident, a storm, a slip, or bad luck carved into stone. The detective read them all, not because she believed in speculation, but because sometimes truth arrives in fragments, whispered by strangers who notice details professionals overlook. She returned to the site, alone this time, the seam now widened, the crevice mapped and measured. She traced the angles of rock with her hands, feeling where stone had shifted and where dust had sealed cracks. She imagined two bodies pressed in, one after the other, perhaps trying to shelter from rain, perhaps stumbling, perhaps fleeing something unseen. The canyon did not answer. Wind scraped the walls, a sound like breath caught between teeth. In the following weeks, technicians reconstructed the scene in 3 dimensions, layering scans and simulations. They ran models of rockfall trajectories, pressure vectors, and collapse probabilities. Most suggested an accident was plausible, yet probability does not equal certainty. The detective lingered on the anomalies: the map folded, the pendant polished, the blurred photograph, threads that refused to weave neatly into nature's tapestry. She thought about the last line of that anonymous letter years before. You'll find them where water hides, boxed by hands that stack. The handwriting returned to her mind like a ghost tapping on glass. Boxed by hands. She had dismissed it once, but now she wondered. Had someone moved stones after the collapse, hiding bodies within a makeshift tomb? 17 years is long enough for memory to rot. But Stone remembers in silence. She placed her hand against the wall of the crevice and closed her eyes, letting the cool weight seep into her bones. Behind her, the canyon stretched, vast and unconcerned, as if reminding her that some truths are too heavy to lift all at once. She left with more questions than answers, but also with a flicker of resolve. Closure was the word everyone wanted, but she knew better. What they had was an opening, a door into a story that had only begun to show its edges, and she would not stop until she had walked through. The canyon was no longer a wilderness, but a crime scene in suspended animation. Each day fresh teams arrived, geologists, forensic pathologists, and detectives, hardened by time yet unsettled by what the rock had concealed. They set up tents and floodlights, pinned maps to boards, and layered evidence tags in colors that glowed against stone. The seam in the canyon became a point of pilgrimage for officials and onlookers alike, a wound reopened after 17 years of rumor. The detective moved among them quietly, a sentinel threading through noise, her notebook growing thick with observations that refused to cohere. The fractures in bone, the folded map, the pendant untouched, and always that blurred photograph on the recovered camera card, replayed again and again, each pixel studied, as if it might finally resolve into truth. When analyzed under enhancement, the final image revealed more than shadows. There was a shape in the upper left corner, indistinct but undeniably human, an outline of a shoulder, an arm, and the curve of a face half turned. Whether it was Michael or Elena, or someone else entirely, no one could say. The image sparked fresh theories. A third figure in the canyon that day. To the families, it was an unbearable closure promised, then snatched away by a smear of digital noise. To the detective, it was confirmation of her unease. A storm had passed through the canyon the day they vanished. Records from 17 years prior confirmed it. Lightning strikes, flash floods, shifting rock, all natural hazards that could trap or kill. Yet storms do not fold maps, nor polish pendants, nor leave images of figures blurred in haste. She began to reassemble the timeline with forensic discipline. Michael and Elena set out early, the weather clear. Witnesses saw them at a roadside market mid-morning, cheerful and unhurried. By noon, cloud cover rolled in, lowering light and pressing shadows against the canyon walls. Sometime after, their path diverged, leading to the crevice where they would remain entombed until chance opened stone again. But there were gaps, and gaps breed speculation. She reviewed logs from the original investigation, volunteer rosters, ranger notes, and civilian interviews. One entry caught her attention, a hiker's report from the same day. He had turned back early when the storm gathered, but mentioned seeing 3 figures on the switchback ahead, not 2. The detail had been buried, dismissed as an error in bad visibility. Yet paired with the blurred photograph, it whispered of possibilities once ignored. The detective reached out and found the hiker, now older and grayer, still living in the same town. Over coffee, she asked him to revisit the memory. He hesitated, then admitted he still believed what he saw. Not 2 hikers, but 3, silhouetted against the ridge. He had convinced himself over years that stress and weather had tricked his eyes, but the certainty in his voice suggested otherwise. Back in the canyon, the detective traced alternate paths. Old logging spurs, deer trails worn thin, and dry washes that could funnel travelers into blind corners. She walked them alone at dawn, listening to the canyon breathe. At one point, she stopped where 2 gullies met, the walls streaked with water stains, and imagined the sound of voices rising with thunder. Could there have been an encounter? A confrontation? In town, locals revived old stories. A hermit who had lived in a shack upriver, vanishing the same season Michael and Elena did. A drifter rumored to sleep in abandoned mines. A former ranger who quit suddenly, his record peppered with disputes. Names resurfaced like debris after a flood. each carrying weight, each blurring into myth. The detective sifted them carefully, knowing rumor corrodes truth, but also knowing it sometimes masks a shard of it. Forensic results trickled in, each one a fragment. Michael's watch had stopped at 2:17 p.m., not by battery, but by trauma. Elena's skull fracture showed blunt force delivered at close range, inconsistent with falling debris alone. The soil samples embedded in clothing suggested they had lain first in open ground before being pressed into the crevice by later collapse. It painted a picture of bodies moved, repositioned, and hidden. Someone had touched them after death. Someone had made decisions. These results did not reach the families immediately. To tell them now would be to rip apart the fragile hope of an accidental explanation. But the detective knew time would strip away that comfort anyway. She prepared her words carefully, rehearsing them like confessions. At night she dreamed of the canyon folding inward, walls pressing tight, and voices echoing against stone, always just beyond recognition. The canyon became a character in her mind, not passive, but complicit, an accomplice that had shielded truth for 17 years. One evening she drove out alone and parked at the trailhead where Michael's car had been found. The gravel lot was quiet, bathed in a red sunset. She sat with her hands on the wheel, imagining them stepping out that morning, lacing boots, adjusting packs, unaware that they were walking not into wilderness, but into history. She whispered their names into the air, as though the canyon might respond. Silence answered, but silence now seemed to carry intent. Evidence was mounting, but evidence without narrative is dust. She needed the story, the thread that tied the folded map, polished pendant, blurred photograph, fractures, soil displacement, and 3 figures. She needed the canyon to speak in sentences, not fragments, and she knew it would take more than stone to unlock that. She would need people who had lived at the canyon's edges, those who had walked its trails before memory dimmed, and those who might still carry secrets in silence. Because while the canyon had buried the bodies, it was human hands, she was increasingly certain, that had written the ending. The canyon had revealed bones, but what haunted the detective most was the idea that a living presence might still cling to its shadow. 17 years was long enough for most suspects to vanish into obscurity, but killers often leave trails, even when they believe the wilderness has erased them. She started with the mining shaft. Records showed it had collapsed years before, sealing tunnels once dug by prospectors. But satellite images and ground surveys revealed faint footpaths leading to it long after it was officially abandoned. Someone had been there, returning again and again, as if tethered by ritual. She hiked to the shaft at dawn, alone but alert, boots crunching gravel as the canyon exhaled mist. The opening yawned like a throat, barred by broken timbers, with weeds knotted across the entrance. A scatter of objects lay nearby. Rusted cans, the charred remains of small fires, and a fragment of cloth, too degraded to identify. She crouched and brushed dirt aside, revealing a bottle cap manufactured in 2007, years after Michael and Elena had vanished. Someone had camped here since. Back at headquarters, she dug deeper into property records. A parcel near the canyon's edge had changed hands 3 times in 2 decades. Each time purchased in cash by names that led nowhere. Shell owners, pseudonyms, and transactions meant to bury identity. But one name recurred in whispers, a man called Hollis. The retired ranger had mentioned him without certainty. Locals had hinted at him with unease, and an old police report listed him as a person of interest in a different case of intimidation near a trail. No arrest, no charges. Just a pattern of proximity. The detective pulled his file from the archives. Photographs faded, fingerprints smudged, and an address long abandoned. He had been a drifter, a miner who never mined, living at the edges of wilderness, known for tempers and silences. Last seen in town, the very week Michael and Elena vanished. Rumors said he left after the storm, but others swore they had glimpsed him in the years since, ragged, moving between abandoned cabins, always near water, always near stone. She traced gas receipts, supply logs, and pawnshop ledgers. A series of transactions surfaced. Small purchases of food, tools, and fuel spread across years, each tied to a name too generic to anchor, but handwriting that bore resemblance across slips. The man might still walk somewhere in the canyon's orbit, invisible in plain sight. Meanwhile, forensic work on the clothing fragments uncovered something darker. Fibers from Elena's jacket carried microscopic traces of an adhesive, the kind used in industrial tape, residue inconsistent with simple outdoor wear. To bind, to seal, to restrain, those were the implications. It suggested human interference at a level more deliberate than concealment. The detective sat with the evidence in silence, feeling the canyon press against her chest even miles away. When she briefed the families, she kept her words careful, but could not hide the weight. "We are considering the possibility of foul play," she said. A mother gripped her wrist, eyes burning with both gratitude and dread. 17 years, we thought nature took them. If it wasn't nature, she couldn't finish. The detective nodded, her voice quiet. Then, it was someone who chose to. Pressure mounted from above. The media began circling again, cameras flashing, headlines screaming of killers still at large. Some framed it as a mystery, others as a menace. The canyon itself became a spectacle, with hikers drawn by morbid curiosity, whispering about ghosts, and some leaving flowers at the trailhead as if it were a shrine. The detective knew spectacle corrodes truth, and so she moved faster. She tracked down one of Hollis's known associates, a man who had served time for burglary and now lived in a rusting trailer by a highway. The man was gaunt and wary, but talkative after hours of silence. Hollis was different, he said, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. Didn't like people. Said hikers were pests and trespassers. Carried grudges like rocks in his pockets. That canyon, he said it was his. Like he owned it. The man leaned closer, voice dropping. He talked once about putting people where no one would find them. Said the canyon would keep secrets if you stacked the stones right. The detective froze at the phrasing. Stacked. The word echoed the anonymous letter from years before. You'll find them where water hides, boxed by hands that stack. It was no coincidence. She drove back into the canyon under moonlight, headlights raking over jagged stone. She parked and walked into the dark until the world narrowed to her flashlight beam. She stopped at the crevice where Michael and Elena had been found. The rocks around it were unnatural, not in shape, but in pattern. Some had been placed, aligned in ways water alone would not arrange. She crouched, running her fingers along edges smoothed not by erosion but by handling. Human geometry disguised as nature's randomness. Hollis had been here. She could feel it. The detective stood in silence, the canyon pressing around her like a tomb. She whispered their names again into the void, and the wind answered with nothing but its own cold breath. Yet now she knew she was not listening to the canyon alone. She was listening to a man who had believed himself a master of silence, a man who might still be walking somewhere just beyond the edge of sight. The search for Hollis became less an inquiry and more a hunt. His name had always been spoken as rumor, never as presence, yet now the evidence gathered itself into shape. The detective pinned his photograph grainy, aged above the maps in her office. Lines threaded outward, old reports of trespass, whispered sightings near cabins, supply purchases that never aligned with a declared address. His shadow lengthened across 17 years. She drove to the outskirts of nearby towns, knocking on doors, pressing photographs into calloused hands. Most shook their heads, but a few hesitated, their eyes flickering with something between memory and fear. He came by once, said a woman who ran a remote store. Bought rope and kerosene, paid cash. This was, I can't remember, but it was after people started talking about the missing hikers. Another man, a hunter, leaned on his truck and said, "If Hollis wanted you gone, you'd be gone." He was the kind who didn't need guns, just patience, and that canyon gave him plenty. Rumors became patterns. Patterns suggested presence. The detectives circled the canyon again, this time searching for the places a man like Hollis might have lived unseen. Abandoned cabins stood in the woods like broken teeth, moss eating through roofs, stoves cold but still ringed with stones blackened from fires. In one, she found a pile of bones, not human, but deer, stripped clean, stacked in a crude pyramid. In another, she found a wall, carved with marks, tally lines etched deep into timber. No names, no explanations, just time counted in silence. The forensic team tested soil from the mining shaft again, comparing it to fibers recovered from Michael's clothing. This time they found a closer match to microscopic pollen from plants that only grew near the shaft's mouth. It meant the bodies had been there, if only briefly. A staging ground, a liminal place before concealment. Hollis had moved them. The detective returned to the shaft under storm clouds, her flashlight piercing damp air. She crouched at the entrance, noting scratches in stone, parallel, repeated, rope marks. Something had been dragged. The air smelled faintly of rust, though no metal remained. She stood there until rain slicked her hair and ran down her face, until she felt the weight of history pressing her into the mud. That night she called the families again. They gathered in the same community hall, where photographs of Michael and Elena had once been pinned during the search. The detective's voice was steady as she explained the findings. Rope marks, fibers, tally lines, and evidence of human concealment. A mother wept openly, her grief now sharpened into fury. 17 years we thought the canyon took them, but it was a man, she said, voice cracking. A man who walked free while we buried empty coffins. The detective let silence follow, not filling it, not soothing. Some truths cannot be softened. From that moment, the case shifted. It was no longer framed as an accident or misadventure, but as homicide. Officially, Hollis became the prime suspect. His file reopened, his name inked in bold on warrants long dormant. The search for him spread beyond the canyon. Old associates were traced, states contacted, and border records checked. Nothing definitive surfaced. It was as if Hollis had dissolved into the stone itself, a ghost of his own making. Yet the detective believed otherwise. Men like him do not vanish. They burrow. They root themselves where silence is thickest. And the canyon had always been his refuge. One evening, while reviewing evidence alone, she noticed something overlooked. The blurred photograph from Michael's recovered camera card, long believed to show an indistinct third figure when digitally enhanced again under new software, revealed more. The outline of the shoulder bore a patch of light that could only be fabric, striped in a pattern inconsistent with either victim's clothing. Stripes like those described in a decades-old witness report of Hollis's jacket. The blurred image was no longer just a shadow. It was testimony. She pinned it to the board, the canyon watching her through every line. Days later, a call came from a ranger still patrolling near the canyon's edge. He had found a lean-to, recently used. The ashes of the fire were warm, food wrappers no more than days old. Whoever had camped there had left in haste. Among the debris lay a knife, its handle wrapped in electrical tape, its blade rusted but sharp. Forensics would later confirm microscopic traces of human blood in the cracks, degraded beyond dating, but damning all the same. Hollis was not gone. He was near. The detective felt it in her bones, the same way she felt the canyon's silence when she stood in its mouth. He was watching, perhaps even listening, as the walls closed in on him after 17 years of borrowed time. The canyon had become less a landscape and more a stage, and the detective knew Hollis was still somewhere behind its curtain. His absence was too deliberate, his traces too precise. Warm ashes abandoned, wrappers scattered, a knife left as if daring discovery. It was not a flight but a theater. Hollis wanted the chase, perhaps even the confrontation. The team returned to Cold Spring Canyon in force, this time not as searchers for lost hikers, but as hunters tracking a living man. Drones swept the air, their whirring eyes tracing every ridge and shadow. On the ground, dogs strained against leashes, noses pulling towards scent that clung to trees and stone. The detective walked with them, her gaze drawn always to the darker crevices, the places silence pooled thickest. Rain threatened again, clouds pressing low, as if the canyon itself remembered the storm that had begun all of this 17 years before. At the mouth of the mining shaft, the dogs grew agitated. Their handlers pulled them back, but the detective crouched, studying fresh marks in the mud boot prints, too recent to belong to her team. The prints angled toward a narrow path that snaked higher into the canyon, a trail not on any map, carved by someone who had walked it enough to wear stone smooth. They followed cautiously, rifles raised, radios whispering. The path ended at a bluff, overlooking the valley where Michael and Elena had once disappeared into shadow. And there, tucked against the rock, was another shelter, crude but functional canvas strung with wire, a cot inside, a metal canteen, still half full. Papers lay scattered on a wooden crate. The detective approached slowly, heart hammering. She picked one up, handwriting jagged, words cramped, journals, pages filled with fragments, complaints about trespassers, rants against rangers, muttered oaths about people who don't belong here, and among them, a chilling line repeated across entries. The canyon is mine to keep, mine to take back. She flipped pages, scanning years compressed into ink. There were notes that matched search dates, cryptic references to storms, to covering tracks, and to the pair who thought they could walk my land. Her hands shook. These were not confessions in the legal sense, but they were close to a map of a disturbed mind weaving its claim into the canyon itself. But Hollis was not there. The fire in the shelter was cold. The cot bore the shape of someone who had risen recently, perhaps hours earlier. The detective felt the canyon's breath on her neck, the sense of being observed from somewhere unseen. Her radio crackled, and one of the officers stationed near the trailhead reported movement in the trees, a flicker of a tall, hunched figure watching. By the time they converged, the figure was gone, only branches swaying as if disturbed by more than wind. Night fell hard. They camped near the bluff, wary and alert. The detective sat awake, reading more from the journals under a lantern's glow. One entry described the storm 17 years ago in detail, uncannily to the day Michael and Elena disappeared. Hollis had written about the two caught where they shouldn't be, and how the rocks swallowed them whole. He had described the mining shaft as the throat where silence eats, words that mirrored the evidence uncovered. The canyon was no longer just a backdrop. It had been a partner, an accomplice, and a container for his madness. At dawn, they descended again, this time tracing streams that cut across the canyon floor. There, wedged between roots, they found a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, personal effects. A wristwatch, its glass cracked. A necklace, dulled by dirt. The detective knew, without asking, they belonged to Michael and Elena. More trophies, kept close, hidden but not discarded. Forensics later confirmed fingerprints faint, partial, but consistent with Hollis's file. It was the first physical tie between him and the couple. Still, he eluded them. He was a ghost in his own domain, slipping between rocks, moving in silence. Yet each trace he left felt less like concealment and more like invitation. He wanted them to follow. He wanted his story acknowledged. The detective stood on a ridge as dusk fell again, looking out over the endless folds of stone. Somewhere out there was a man who believed the canyon was his kingdom, who had claimed 2 lives and hidden them for nearly 2 decades. And now, with his journals exposed and his trophies found, his silence was crumbling. The detective tightened her jacket against the wind, and whispered to the canyon itself, 17 years of silence. It ends now. And for the first time, she thought she heard something stir in reply. Not just wind, but the faint echo of footsteps retreating deeper into the dark. The final push came not from science or maps, but from instinct, sharpened by weeks of tracing shadows and whispers. The detective knew Hollis had grown careless, not out of mistake, but out of need. For 17 years he had lived in silence, unseen, unchallenged. But now, as investigators peeled away his secrecy, he wanted to be acknowledged. Predators often circle back to the places they claim. She chose the mining shaft, the mouth that had once swallowed Michael and Elena, and set her watch there as dusk bled into canyon walls. Officers spread wide, their presence masked by the hush of settling night. The air was heavy, the canyon holding its breath. Hours passed, darkness pressed close, and then, faint at first, came the scrape of stone against the boot. A figure moved along the ridge, tall, shoulders stooped, hair long and wild in the half-light. Hollis. He paused at the shaft's entrance, as though greeting an old confessor. The detective watched from the shadows, every muscle tight. She could hear the gravel grind under his weight as he crouched and touched the timbers, a gesture almost reverent. Then his voice broke the silence, low and rough. 17 years, and they still talk. They were mine to put away. Mine. The detective stepped forward, her voice carrying across the stone. You took them. Hollis stilled. Slowly he turned, eyes catching lantern light, hollow and feral. For a moment he did not move, as if deciding whether to flee or fight. Then he smiled, thin and joyless. They walked where they shouldn't. The canyon keeps what's hers. I only helped. Officers rose from the dark around him, rifles aimed, radios crackling. Hollis straightened, shoulders rising like stone walls. You think you've caught me, but I've been here all along. I live in the cracks. I am the cracks. His hand twitched toward his coat. Shouts cut the air. Hands up! Don't move! He froze, then slowly lifted both arms. His palms trembled, fingers scarred. For a breath, it seemed, surrender had come. But then, with a roar, he lunged toward the shaft, as if diving back into the mouth that had protected him for so long. Officers tackled him hard, the canyon erupting with struggle. Rocks clattered, dust rose, and voices barked commands. Hollis fought with the desperation of a man who had only ever belonged to silence. But silence could not save him now. They dragged him back, bound his wrists, and forced him to the ground. His face pressed into dirt. He whispered words no one wanted to hear. There are more, always more. The canyon never empties. They hauled him away, his voice echoing even as distance swallowed him. For the families, the arrest brought answers but not peace. They gathered once more at the crevice where bones had been found, the detective standing with them. She told them the truth plainly. Hollis had confessed enough to bind him to the crime, his journals and trophies filling the gaps. He had seen Michael and Elena as intruders in a world he believed was his to control. He had struck, concealed, and trusted the canyon to finish what he began. A mother laid flowers at the stone, her hands trembling. At least we know, she whispered. But knowing did not heal. The canyon was no less vast, no less cruel, and no less complicit in the silence it had carried for nearly 2 decades. The detective lingered alone after they left, her gaze locked on the walls, rising high above. She thought of Hollis's words, "The canyon never empties." And she wondered how many more secrets lay hidden in rock, waiting for storms to unearth them. In court, Hollis sat, as he had been found stooped, eyes wild, voice rasping. He spoke little, but when he did, it was not of guilt or regret. It was of territory, trespass, and the belief that silence is ownership. He was convicted and sentenced to life without release. Yet, even behind bars, his presence lingered in the canyon, a ghost whose claim could not be erased by metal doors. The detective filed her reports, closed the case, and drove away one final time. But as the canyon shrank in her rearview mirror, she could not shake the sense that Hollis had been right about one thing. Silence never truly releases what it holds. That night, in her home far from stone and storm, she replayed the blurred photograph of Michael and Elena, the last image before they vanished. She studied their faces, their joy, and the way light had touched them, and then she closed her eyes and let their names rest on her tongue, giving them back to the silence with reverence rather than fear. Michael, Elena. The canyon had taken them, and Hollis had hidden them, but their story had been pulled back into light. In the end, that was all the living could do. Speak the names of the lost, refuse the erasure of silence, and remember, the canyon loomed still, vast and indifferent, its rocks holding echoes of storms past and storms yet to come. But somewhere in that dark stone, the truth had been carved. Truth dragged from silence after 17 years, truth that would not be buried again. And for those who listened, it spoke with a voice that was both warning and requiem. Beware the places that keep their own secrets, for they do not give them back without a cost. If you found this story haunting and want to hear more tales where the truth hides beneath decades of silence, don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories waiting in the dark, and together we'll bring them to light.